Good evening and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Layal Freije. I'm a journalist. I've been covering the Middle East for 6-7 years, and I'm gonna be moderating the debate today. So today we ask the question, is a critique of Israel the same as anti-Semitism? And to do that, we have to understand the concept of the new anti-Semitism. For that, we've invited Jamie Stern-Weiner from Britain, the UK. You are, you recently handed over your PhD, or you got your PhD at Oxford University, where you researched on politics and the new anti-Semitism. So you're going to explain for us what it is and what it means for the way we understand anti-Semitism today. And we have Poya Pakzad, who is local, Danish, and you are an editor of Eftertryk, a magazine in Denmark, and you work with the Palestine-Israel war, conflict, call it whatever, for many, many years. And with you, we're going to try to understand the new anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in Denmark, the recent years, and the laws. It's not a law yet, but an agreement that the Danish government has made with several parties about how to fight anti-Semitism in Denmark. And at least, but not last, we have you, Wieland Hoban, from Germany. You are chairman at the, and I'm going to read it from my notes here because it's a very long name. You are chairman at the Jewish Voice for Just Peace in the Middle East. And you're going to talk about the German experience with the new anti-Semitism. And also you have a book coming out about the Palestine-Israel conflict and from the German perspective. Maybe you can tell us more about that when it's your turn. So we're going to start with you, Jamie. You have around 20 minutes to tell us about the new anti-Semitism. Maybe I should just note that we will do the presentations. You will do your presentations for around 55 minutes, an hour. Then we will have 10 minutes break. And then we can take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions while you listen to the panel, please write it down and I will be happy to hear them later on. So thank you.
Can you hear me? No. Great start. Now? Oh.
Switch on.
Now.
Yeah. Want me to attach?
Yeah. Thank you. We're about to see a giant IHRA definition. Warning. I'm very glad we're having this conversation today. Sadly, it couldn't be more timely, and I want to thank all the organisers for putting it together, especially Jonathan, Ofir. It's also a special pleasure for me, even in this horrible moment, to speak alongside Poya. We've been corresponding about these issues for some years now. And after the meeting, if you want to read an excellent long overview, which really dives deep into a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today in Danish, he's written an excellent essay in, I guess, the latest issue of Eftertryk, which I can warmly recommend. So we're meeting nearly a year in now to Israel's destruction of the Gaza Strip, which it has all but accomplished, very possibly on the precipice of an even more devastating regional war. Over the past 12 months, the preeminent political and judicial institutions of the international community have repeatedly condemned Israel's onslaught. So, for example, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he testified that, quote, "The level of suffering we're witnessing in Gaza is unprecedented in my mandate. I've never seen such a level of death and destruction." The European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, publicly affirmed that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, he applied for arrest warrants to be issued against Israel's Prime Minister and Israel's Defense Minister on suspicion of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Independent Commission of Inquiry, appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, found that Israel had intentionally caused, quote, "the near total destruction of civilian objects in Gaza." That Israel's attack was, quote, "directed against the civilian population as a whole," and that Israel had committed in Gaza, quote, "the crime against humanity of extermination." And the International Court of Justice, the supreme judicial organ of the United Nations, found in January of this year that Israel was plausibly committing the crime of crimes, genocide. More broadly, in July, the court found that Israel is committing the international crime of apartheid in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, which means all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, its presence there is illegal. So, in short, Israel's conduct has received wall-to-wall condemnation, and in the most grave terms, from the most respected pillars of the international community. Now, Israel's response was to accuse these political and judicial authorities, the UN, the EU, the ICC, the ICJ, of antisemitism. So you have this fellow named Israel Katz, he's the foreign minister of Israel. He denounced the United Nations under Secretary General Guterres as an anti-Semitic and anti-Israel body. The same official, the Foreign Minister of Israel, denounced Josep Borrell of the EU as, quote, "an anti-Semite and Israel hater." Israel's Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, accused the International Court of Justice of spreading, quote, "Nazi propaganda." And Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, he ranked the chief prosecutor of the ICC among the great anti-Semites in modern times, like the UN and the EU and so on, charging that his application for Netanyahu's arrest amounted to, quote, "the new anti-Semitism." Well, these attempts to insulate Israel from critical scrutiny by demonizing Israel's critics as anti-Semitic, they're by no means a new phenomenon, but they have drawn support and succor in recent years from something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. Now this IHRA definition, as it's known, it's become pretty influential, although it's also very controversial. Many European governments have, in some way or another, endorsed some variant of this text, including Denmark. It's also referenced in the anti-Semitism policy of the European Commission, and many private entities, from universities to political parties to social media platforms, have incorporated the definition in their codes of conduct, and they are constantly prevailed upon to then use the definition to regulate what can be said and what can't be said in those spaces, to censor speech. I want to use my opening remarks tonight to provide a brief overview of this thing called the IHRA definition, how it came to be, what's wrong with it, and why anyone genuinely concerned with fighting anti-Semitism and defending human rights more broadly should steer well clear of it and the ideas that it expresses. I'm going to make 3 basic points about the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Number 1, it's not IHRA's. Number 2, it doesn't work. Indeed, it barely qualifies as a definition. Number 3, it's got nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism. So, let's start with the claims made by the supporters of this definition. More on them later. That the definition is both effective and indispensable for fighting anti-Semitism. Is that claim true or even remotely plausible? It first merits noting that no evidence has ever been presented of any kind ever that adopting any anti-Semitism definition, let alone this one, has been effective in reducing anti-Semitism. Just no evidence has been presented. Katharina von Stern-Weiner, the European Commissioner, who's been a big promoter of this text, she keeps saying it's evidence-based. She's yet to provide any of that evidence. Furthermore, organisations responsible for monitoring and fighting anti-Semitism, they've repeatedly over the years declined or been very reluctant to use the definition, which would be odd if it was effective and indispensable for their task. To give one revealing example, which we only know about because of freedom of information documents acquired by an Israeli journalist called Itai Mashiach, when the German government was considering whether to issue some kind of statement recognising the IHRA definition in 2017, internally they asked all of their actual technical experts from other departments who are responsible for fighting anti-Semitism whether this was a good idea. And the assessment of those internal experts was that the IHRA definition was at best useless and unnecessary, and at worst actively counterproductive. And those departments only agreed to the Cabinet's eventual recognition of the definition when the wording was watered down, so that it would be purely symbolic. Originally the wording said applying the definition, and it ended up being like noting the definition. So they were like, okay, this won't mean anything, we can get on with the serious work, fine. Not what you'd expect if, indeed, the definition is indispensable for fighting anti-Semitism. Now let's look at the IHRA text itself. I've never seen it blown up so big, it looks even worse now. Well, for any definition of anti-Semitism to be successful, what's the criteria? It has to be clear, has to be concrete, and has to be capable of being applied consistently. The whole point of it is, you know, if you look at a statement or an action and want to know if it's anti-Semitic, and you apply this definition to find the answer, and I do the same, we're going to reach the same verdict, because we both have this clear, consistent, common benchmark to refer to. That's the point of it. Does the IHRA definition meet these requirements, or, on the contrary, is it vague and ideologically loaded? Well, the definition itself, which is on the screen, it comprises just 2 sentences. The key bit is highlighted. It reads like this. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Okay. I think it doesn't take a rocket science to spot the problem there. To say that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, it doesn't clarify what kind of perception that is. And to say that anti-Semitism may be expressed as hatred towards Jews leaves open that it may be expressed in any number of other ways. Maybe love of Jews, maybe indifference towards Jews. It hardly rules out anything. So in other words, this so-called indispensable critical anti-Semitism definition, it's not just vague, it verges on being meaningless, literally. Now there's a second element that often accompanies or is appended to the IHRA definition. And that's a list of 11 illustrative examples, 11 examples of potentially anti-Semitic speech. Now notice I said potentially anti-Semitic speech. That's because the text states that those examples could, taking into account the overall context, constitute anti-Semitism. Again, I don't think we need to disturb our busy friend the rocket scientist to see the problem. Any statement theoretically could be an example of anti-Semitism. It all depends, as the IHRA text says, on the overall context. So the obvious question then is, what sort of overall context would be considered qualifying? Alas, the IHRA text says nothing at all about this. It doesn't say anything about what context should qualify as rendering a statement anti-Semitic. Finally, let's look at these 11 examples of possible anti-Semitic speech. 4 of the 11 refer to statements about Israel. Kind of funny in an anti-Semitism definition. For reasons of, 7 make reference to Israel, but 4 are about kind of speech about Israel directly. For reasons of time, let's just look at the most obviously problematic of these. Applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behaviour not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Let's set aside for now the questionable assertion smuggled into this supposedly neutral expert definition of anti-Semitism that Israel is a democratic nation, even as it has refused to extend political rights to millions of Palestinians under its rule. The question remains, who's guilty of these double standards? It's clearly completely in the eye of the beholder and dependent on your view of many controversial questions at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict. According to Israel and its supporters, for example, everyone from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to the European Union to the United Nations to the International Criminal Court to the International Court of Justice, they're guilty of treating Israel with double standards. Recall again that the whole point of a definition is to be clear, unambiguous, and not politically loaded, so it can fulfill its function of reducing the scope for interpretive disagreement on the part of different people. So if including as a criterion of anti-Semitic speech something like applying double standards to Israel, it doesn't just fall short of the requirements of a good definition, it completely negates them, makes a mockery of them, as it requires that any anti-Semitism investigator, and the claim is that this is meant for police on the street who arrive to a crime scene and have to quickly decide, is this incident anti-Semitic or not? They first got to take a position on Zionism, the occupation, the whole Israel-Palestine conflict to decide, have double standards been applied. So, just to recap our Talmudic exegesis, this oh so important IHRA definition, without which it's just impossible to combat anti-Semitism, would be totally lost without this text. In fact, it's the international, global, universal gold standard for understanding what anti-Semitism is. Well, what does this sacred text tell us? It says anti-Semitism is some kind of a perception of Jews, but it doesn't say what kind. Then there's a list of examples that say that some kinds of speech about Israel could, depending on the context, be anti-Semitic, but it doesn't tell us in what context. And then some of the examples, they include criteria whose application cannot but be wildly subjective and therefore wide open to political bias. And furthermore, this is all very clear to anyone who just reads the text. And I think that's worth pointing out because I can't tell you how many disquisitions and treatises and tracts have been written either defending or analysing this text, analysing every letter of every word. And it's just a completely idiotic document which anyone can see by giving it a moment's thought. I once wrote that never before have so many written so much about something so manifestly absurd. And that's something to bear in mind the next time you see some official adopting a grave tone, pretending to take anti-Semitism seriously, and then presenting you with this verbal porridge as if it was the answer. They're just insulting your intelligence and they're playing politics with Jewish safety into the bargain. Well, this just raises the obvious question. If the IHRA text is so stupid, why all the fuss? Why has so much energy been expended to promote it on the one hand, and why are people like us bothering to object to it. And that brings us to my second point. It's not really IHRA's definition. It's Israel's definition of anti-Semitism. I earlier quoted Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu construing any arrest warrant issued against him by the ICC as comprising the new anti-Semitism. That choice of epithet by him is quite instructive. Israel and certain pro-Israel groups have promoted this notion of a new anti-Semitism all the way back since the early 1970s. It's not really about anti-Semitism, it's also not new. It started when Israel first came under pressure to withdraw from occupied Arab territory in the early 1970s in exchange for peace, and in particular with Egypt. The basic idea of the new anti-Semitism claim is that much or most international criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism in disguise, whereas classical anti-Semitism targets Jews as individuals or communities. The new anti-Semitism targets the Jewish state as a more politically correct outlet for that same age-old, unchanging animus. A former Israeli minister, who was also the head of the Jewish Agency for a long time, Natan Sharansky, he helpfully summarized the insights of this genre in 2004 in a formulation he called the 3 Ds. When Israel was delegitimized, when it's demonized, and when double standards, our old friend double standards, were applied to it, here Sharansky said was the new anti-Semitism at work. Now, I think the political agenda at play here doesn't really need spelling out, any more than it needs spelling out that when a working definition of Islamophobia defines as Islamophobic opposition to Muslim self-determination in Palestine and Kashmir, as there is such a text, that might have something to do with the fact that the drafters of that definition support Palestinian and Kashmiri states. Now, in 2004, against the backdrop of heightened international criticism of Israel during the Second Intifada, a handful of pro-Israel Jewish organizations, led by the American Jewish Committee, they drafted what they called a redefinition of anti-Semitism. Why redefinition? Well, because it included the tenets of the new anti-Semitism. It included Sharansky's 3 Ds. Sharansky later said he was very happy to see that his great invention, the 3 Ds, had been baked into this working definition. Well, that 2004 definition is essentially the same text as the one we now call the IHRA definition. What basically happened is the American Jewish Committee managed through various means to persuade an agency of the European Union, it was called the EUMC, to circulate the Israel lobby's definition as a non-official draft text. Then some pro-Israel groups started to use that text against Palestine solidarity activists. They dragged the EU and the EUMC's name into these efforts. They pretended that this definition was the formal EU definition, the formal European definition, or the formal EUMC definition, which it wasn't. So, embarrassed, the successor organisation of the EUMC, called the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, that still exists today, it deleted that definition from its website in 2013. Cue outrage from the Israeli government and pro-Israel organisations. They all met in Jerusalem and they decided we've got to find, this is in 2015, we've got to find a new home for this definition. And they found it in 2016 in this intergovernmental body called the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which up to that point was just a sleepy intergovernmental body that brought together researchers and officials from different European countries to coordinate on Holocaust education, museums and remembrance and that kind of thing. So the key point then is that the so-called IHRA definition, it was in fact conceived, drafted and promoted from the start and up to now by pro-Israel lobby groups. The main group responsible in 2004 for the original drafting, as I said, was the American Jewish Committee, the group which engineered the adoption of the definition in 2016 by the IHRA was called the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Both of those organizations engage in reflexive lobbying for Israel and routinely depict legitimate Palestine solidarity activism, as well as accurate criticism of Israel, as anti-Semitic. So the AJC, for example, declared anti-Zionism and the movement to boycott Israel anti-Semitic, and it condemned Amnesty International, the leading human rights organization, as having earned, quote, a place of dishonor in the annals of anti-Semitism. In practical terms, the AJC has promoted Israel's line on every critical international controversy. Even where it disapproves of Israeli policy, the AJC pledged in 2020, we will always be their advocates. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, meanwhile, referred to Israel's pre-June 1967 borders, which is to say its legal borders, as Auschwitz lines, and it likened the European Union guidelines prohibiting funding to institutions which operate in Israel's settlements, which contravene international law. It likened them to the Nazi boycott of the Jews. It also, in 2016, branded a UN Security Council resolution which condemned Israel's settlements, again, as the UN has done for many years, as the world's worst anti-Semitic and anti-Israel incident. So these are the kinds of actors who are behind the so-called IHRA definition. That's who you empower when you recognize, endorse, and use the text. That brings me to my final point. It's got nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism properly understood. If the so-called IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is manifestly inadequate for defining or combating anti-Semitism, if it was produced and promoted from the start until now by Israel lobby groups, if its text clearly includes examples like applying double standards to Israel, which can and have easily been used to conflate legitimate, accurate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, then it's clear as day that what we're dealing with here, with this IHRA definition, it's got nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism. It's just a vehicle to legitimize and institutionalize the long-standing view of Israel and its organized supporters that virtually any serious criticism of Israel's constitution and or conduct should be automatically dismissed as bigotry.
And Jamie, you were way over time. So
Am I?
yeah, you are. Because it's very interesting. So it's very hard to cut you off. But 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, then I'll leave with one conclusion. I have 3 concluding reflections. I'll leave with one concluding reflection, which is a more of a tactical one. I think many institutions think they can get away with a purely symbolic recognition of this definition, or like a vague endorsement of it, and thereby they get Israel and its advocates off their back without doing any real harm. And I think the history of the IHRA's drafting and promotion to date really cautions strongly against that. What actually happens over and over and over again is basically when the pro-Israel lobby groups first approach an institution and ask them to adopt this definition, they play it down, it's only symbolic, it's got all these caveats, don't worry, it won't threaten free speech, and so forth. And then as soon as the institution adopts the text, they drop all of those caveats and they press on, they treat it as a sacred text that has to be enforced harshly and fully against their political opponents. If you want any examples of that, you can ask me in the Q&A. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you. So next we have you, Poya, and you're going to talk about the Danish experience with the new antisemitism.
Yes. Hej alle sammen. I kan sikkert ikke høre mig nu, vel? Nej.
Nej, gerne lidt højere.
Kan I høre mig nu? Ja. Sådan. Bare lige for en... Jeg kommer til at tale på engelsk, så at to medgæster kan høre mig. Jeg håber, jeg er okay. Så må jeg bare starte. Jeg håber, jeg har det godt. Alright. I just told them I'm going to speak in English, so you understand me. I wrote this in English. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak at this event alongside two very esteemed guests. And even though the topic at hand is a regrettable deflection of attention from the Israeli assault on Gaza, I still think it's important to talk about the topic, the existence and the abuse of anti-Semitism in society today. It's good for us to know what we're up against and what we're fighting against. And in particular, I'd like to discuss the Danish example, because it's a little different from both the British and the German one, which is completely off the hinges, but more about that. More specifically, I'd like to talk about the two action plans that were unanimously adopted. The first one by the Danish Parliament in 2022, and the other one just recently. How many of you heard of these action plans? I mean, how many of you are versed in this topic? All right. I'll just leave now. I think it's important to view them with a critical lens, but it's also important to actually read them so that our standpoints are informed by facts and not by prejudice. Because as I said to begin with, the situation here is somewhat different than what we experienced in, for example, the UK in 2018, when the UK adopted this. It was in 2018, right? 16. Well, that was in Bucharest. When did the UK adopt it?
The UK in December 2016 was the very
right.
first adoption.
Well, then Labour's adoption, which was highly controversial, and the Danish case is different. Now, I'll come to that. I used to work in Parliament for the Red-Green Alliance. Most of you know it as Enhedslisten. And I had a small part in shaping the scope and the limits of the action plan in 2022. Shortly, I just noticed that my colleague was working on it, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, we're looking at a new definition of anti-Semitism." Me being me, I'd already read James Stern-Weiner, knew what that definition was all about, and I asked him about it out of curiosity. So, what do you think? He said, "Well, it looks harmless. There's no problems." And until now, it's very bad. I mean, all civil rights organizations, leading experts in anti-Semitism, and so on, even the one who purportedly wrote the definition, are saying this is very bad for free speech. So maybe we should have a second look at it. And I volunteered to have a look at it. And it's not on me, but when it was adopted in 2022, it was adopted without the problematic list of 11 examples, which are predominantly about speech on Israel. So what were they about beyond adopting the IHRA definition? The two action plans. The plan outlined 15 initiatives in 2022 aimed at addressing anti-Semitism, mostly symbolic. Funding for mandatory Holocaust education, which I personally think is not bad, to know about European history. It's good to sensitize us towards atrocities such as those that are occurring now around the world. Holocaust history can do that. It can also not, but potentially it can. Then it wanted to promote Danish Jewish cultural history and enhance police training, which is a bit more odious, I think, to prevent radicalization. And some of these initiatives are commendable on the surface, but they're mostly symbolic in nature. And they were never intended otherwise, actually, other than signaling opinions and symbolism. Because we already have hard law on hate crimes, right? It already exists. So these initiatives just supplement them. More concretely, the plan allocated funds to IHRA, which is a part of something called Jewish Society, which is an organization in Denmark which tends to have a pro-Israeli bias and is not necessarily representative of all Danish Jews, as recent debate in the press makes abundantly clear. Okay, the plan also commissioned 3 reports on anti-Semitism in different milieus. One report on anti-Semitism, all online, by the way. in the gaming environment, which is an environment I know very little about, and the right-wing, extreme right-wing environment, and also among Muslim organizations. Have any of you heard of those reports? All right, at least one person that I know. These reports came out of May of this year. I'm quite surprised by some of the findings. I took the time to read through them. I told the organizer that, I have nothing to say in addition to what Jamie and Wieland have to say about this topic, because pretty much covered the whole thing. So if I don't read these reports, I can't say anything. So, I went through the reports. And they do indeed confirm some troubling patterns. So as expected, there is a lot of anti-Semitic speech in the extreme right-wing environments. It's no surprise. And I learned something about insane gaming environments and how they talk to each other. These are kids, some of them. That's really insane, the level of anti-Semitism there is in this kind of, Reddit. Reddit? This forum on the internet, this kind of lulz fashion. Everything is funny, nothing is serious, everybody's a Nazi. However, I was surprised about the findings in the report on Islamic organizations, to be quite honest. Because according to this research, and I kind of struggle calling this research because it came from a government agency and not real scholars, they found, and this is their words, they found very little anti-Semitism in the online material they studied from Islamic organizations. That was unexpected for me, because anecdotally, I think I can, I see plenty of anti-Semitism among my peers. And the anti-Semitism that they did identify coming from Muslim organizations came in the form of intense hatred towards Israel. How? In a specific way, not distinguishing properly between Israel and individual Jews. All right? Collectivization, making individual Jews responsible for the actions of Palestinians. No, I'm sorry, for the actions of Israel. Now, it's important to note that these reports were written prior to the Hamas atrocities on October 7th, and also prior, of course, to the criminally indiscriminate Israeli assault that followed it. And we already know from several studies that there's a very strong correlation between Israeli maltreatment of Palestinians and spikes in anti-Semitism in Europe. We know this from study after study. Even some of these studies come from Israel itself. That's what we're witnessing today as well. The spike is real. There is a spike in anti-Semitic speech and anti-Semitic actions. We need to be clear about that. And against the backdrop of that spike, Parliament produced its second action plan, also symbolic mostly in nature. It does have more odious content than the first one. We'll get into that. And that was adopted this year. Now, let me take a step back for a moment. I know why many of you are here tonight, but at least I'll guess. You've come to hear Jamie, Wieland, and myself speak critically about the misuse of anti-Semitism. That's my guess, because we're all too familiar with how that plays out. Critics of Israel, demonstrators in the street, even academics and professors are outed as anti-Semitic by pro-Israeli smear artists who seek to defend Israel from legitimate criticism. And this tactic takes on various forms. Jamie went into some of it, and I'll delve into some of it later, shortly. However, having read these action plans, I think there's a need for nuanced critique when it comes to the Danish example, because controversially in 2022, when the IHRA was adopted in Denmark, this widely discredited definition, there was something interesting about it. Let me see. Let me find where I am on my paper. I'm sorry. So, if you guys are familiar with the debate surrounding the IHRA, which I assume a lot of you are, it surrounds the examples. Now you just heard a critique of the vague or indefinite definition by itself, but largely the critique that comes from civil society and comes from different actors in society surrounds these 11 examples, because they're quite problematic. But these 11 examples don't appear anywhere in the action plan text of 2022. And this omission is significant. It tells an interesting story. The person who uncovered this, I mean, everyone can uncover it from reading the action plan, but the person who uncovered the fact that these examples are in fact not a part of the definition is with us today. His name is James Stern-Weiner, and through diligent research and numerous Freedom of Information Acts across Europe, he showed that Denmark, in fact, played, or its delegate to the IHRA, played a pivotal role in the adoption of this definition in Bucharest in 2016, because despite immense pressure and a very odd sense of urgency in 2016 that was forced upon all the delegates, Denmark, or our delegate, I won't mention names here because it's embarrassing, but Denmark held firm. The definition should remain separate from the controversial list of examples. This is important because those organizations, which Jamie mentioned before, they kept adamantly saying in the press that it's either the whole definition or nothing. And the whole definition is supposedly the text that Jamie put up on the screen, including the 11 examples. Some of you might remember there was a huge controversy about this in the Labour Party in the UK, in which the Labour Party said, we're going to make our own examples. We're going to fit this into our own context. So we'll just take the little example, the list, the definition in the box, and then we'll come up with, I assume, our own examples. And there were, huge moral spasms in UK press about how Corbyn was an anti-Semite because of this, and so on and so forth. But in fact, the definition is separate from the controversial list of examples, and the person who uncovered it was Jamie. This, unfortunately, has gotten zero coverage in Denmark. The fact that Denmark played this role, along with some other states, but Denmark played a significant role. And there's been no public discussion about it, neither among politicians or in the press. And that's quite odd. But it should reassure us that the most controversial aspects of this in definition are not in fact operative in the Danish case. Unfortunately, because this hasn't been widely covered, many people in the debate who refer to or use the definition in public, they either don't realize or they don't care that the examples aren't part of it. So take IHRA, for example, who I mentioned before, who is getting funds from the government to monitor antisemitism. They rely on the list of examples in their work. And as a result, other civil society organizations, not just civil society organizations, but private consulting companies, which take money to produce reports to show that we have 10 million examples of anti-Semitism on Facebook, they use this list of examples. And obviously that inflates the cases because you're conflating criticism of Israel with hatred of Jews. That's a real problem. This leads me to the second action plan, which was adopted this year. Am I in time?
Yeah, your time is almost up.
Oh, so allow me to speak a little quicker. I don't have time to go into it at greater length, but you see, clearly this action plan oversteps the bounds of even the IHRA definition. Because in the introductory text it just casually says, it's never legitimate to question or criticize the existence of Israel. Like, why? Why is that not legitimate? Why is this? I mean, it's almost taken as, it's so commonplace. You can't question the existence of Israel. It's a very widespread notion. So even as Israel is erasing any territorial basis for a Palestinian state, it's uniquely illegitimate, in fact anti-Semitic, to question the existence of Israel. And we could discuss in the questions and answer sessions, because I don't have much time, why this is in fact an insane proposition, but suffice it to say, no state has an inherent right to exist. No state. Neither morally or legally. Right? A state is a power center. The responsibility to legitimize itself is squarely on the state. It's not on the subjects that it rules, or in the case of Palestinians, represses on a daily basis. This entire recognized Israel shtick just places this burden of responsibility on the subjects. Totally turned on its head. Another major issue is the government's decision to allocate 12 million kroners to research, scholarship into the new anti-Semitism. Not anti-Semitism, but the new anti-Semitism. And, Jamie just went into, this is a deeply flawed concept of anti-Semitism with a long sordid history, used deliberately to conflate criticism of Israel with hatred of Jews. So I'm genuinely puzzled when I read this. I was puzzled by this inclusion of this term, because I am positive that there is not a single politician in Parliament that has any prior knowledge of this concept. Right? So who thought it was a good fit? It really stood out to me when I read it, almost like a red flag. A third issue, which is not written into the text, but which is very widespread also in the debate here in Denmark, is the idea and the tendency to label unbalanced, unfair, or false criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. Like they say, oh, that's over the top, that's anti-Semitic. But why? Just step back for a second and ask, why is it not just unfair, unbalanced, false, wrong, whatever? Why is it anti-Semitic? I mean, Israel is behaving right now in a way that, makes many people angry, excessively angry, at Israel. So anyone knows that might bring with it unfair, unbalanced, even false criticism. Why is that hatred of Jews? But it's just taken as something that's automatic in the debate. And I think that's it tells us something about the tendency of public debate. You want me to stop?
Yeah.
All right.
It was very interesting.
Okay, so can I sum up with one last thing?
Yes, please.
All right. You see, I'm here today with two Jewish guests. I am neither Palestinian nor Jewish or anything. And when I listen to Jamie, and I'm looking very forward to listening to Wieland for the first time, is that I'm quite inspired by the fact of how principled they are. Jamie, I put in the same category as Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein. I think they're so principled when you see a lot of people, when they're under attack, they become nationalist, right? They become impervious to criticism from the outside. But not these guys. So I want to do the same, all right? I want to be as principled as they are. I have an Iranian background. And I'll just say, I think that we do have anti-Semitism in Denmark. In particular, I think we do have anti-Semitism among disaffected, criminalized, hardened Middle Eastern youth in Europe. I don't think we should find that particularly controversial. It has its reasons. It has its cultural reasons, but we need to root it out, and we need to be honest about it. That's the first step in rooting it out. Thank you for listening to me. I hope we can discuss this further.
15 minutes. So your colleagues could not do it on time, so I'm very intrigued to see if you can.
Well, that's why I have this stopwatch here.
set the stage well from different perspectives, academic perspective and organizational and legislative perspectives. And I'm going to talk, well, first of all, very much from the perspective of someone who lives in Germany, and also from an activist perspective, and to some extent also from a Jewish perspective, but that's tied, I would say, more to the activist perspective as well, since I'm chair of a Jewish activist organization. Now, this whole thing, this whole theme is about definitions, and definitions are about meaning, but the word anti-Semitism in Germany has been largely empty of meaning, and I think that's a particularly shocking and regrettable fact in a country responsible historically for the greatest anti-Semitic atrocities in history. You would think that if there's been a real reckoning with that past, which in some areas there has, that at least this concept and this word would be taken so seriously that people would make sure that it has real meaning, that it's not used lightly, that it's not instrumentalized and weaponized for political benefit, for attacking political enemies. But that's exactly what has happened, and what happens on a daily basis. The fact that there even is a definition of anti-Semitism, I think should give us pause for reflection. And the fact that one always talks about it, and the fact that in certain cultural and political circles, it's become a commonplace that there is this definition and that one should follow this definition. And we don't hear discussions about a definition of anti-black racism, of homophobia, of transphobia, of the many other forms of discrimination and minority-based hate. And this should already set off certain alarm bells. And Jane has reconstructed in detail, in various texts and in summarized form here, how that came to be, and this is something that has to be spelled out time and time again. That firstly, this definition in particular, and then secondly, this insistence on having and implementing a definition is something that's politically motivated, and if you spend any time looking at the context, then the political motivation is clearly a pro-Israel one. Now, in Germany, since 2018, there's been a kind of public office, a position, that I refer to in a slightly shortened form as Anti-Semitism Commissioner. The full title would be Commissioner for Jewish Life and the Fight Against Anti-Semitism. There is one at the national level. Each of the 16 federal states of Germany also have their own one. Certain organizations, such as police forces, or more recently also universities, have had anti-Semitism commissioners appointed. So in short, at many different levels in political and civil society structures in Germany, you have these people who are appointed supposedly to monitor and fight anti-Semitism, and also in some areas to deal with Jewish community life. There is often about things that are less political, like question really is the issue of anti-Semitism and the issue of Israel. Now, just to give you one recent example of the exploits of these so-called anti-Semitism commissioners. One of them, who's responsible for the state of Hessen, which is actually the state where I live in Frankfurt. He's been in office for some years, and he was also for a while deputy mayor of Frankfurt. So he's a pretty established local politician. His name is Uwe Becker. And 2 weeks ago, he took part in an event which was held actually at a Jewish sports club, which exists Germany-wide and is also connected internationally. It's called Maccabi. And at the grounds of Maccabi Frankfurt, there was an event which was open to the public, at which this man, this anti-Semitism commissioner, gave awards to 3 young men who had returned to Germany where they lived after serving in the IDF, the Israeli army. I don't have detailed information about what they did there, whether, how many war crimes they may have committed there, whether they were in Gaza, or maybe whether they were just on the border. I don't have detailed information about that. But it's very clear that the mere fact of even doing that, when you're dealing with the army of a state that is, regardless of whether one thinks that it's committing genocide or not, that at least the charge of genocide is being taken very seriously in the world's highest court, that to be giving trophies to them upon their return is extremely perverse. And it actually gets even better, because each of these trophies had, on top of a wooden base, had a piece of, I think, plastic in the shape of historic Palestine, all in one color with the Star of David on it. It wasn't blue and white, but it was clear that this was all being treated as Jewish territory. And actually, it wasn't only Palestine, but Golan Heights were also part of it. So this was a complete annexation. This was a trophy of Greater Israel. And on the base, next to this map, was also a little, a little plaque saying, "Together we will win," and "Hero of Israel from Frankfurt, Operation Iron Sword," which is Israel's official name for the genocide. And I see some expressions of horror and disbelief in the audience, which is very much an appropriate response. And actually, our organization also made this information as public as we could, on our website, social media, writing letters to the local government, his bosses, and publicizing it as much as we could. There was actually a newspaper article about it, which was fairly uncritical, which just mentioned that some activists had attacked him for it, gave him a chance to defend himself, and which he pointed out that on this map, there are lines between the different areas, so this claim of annexation is unfair. And, there are also lines on the map between, different districts of the city, but clearly this was being treated as one territory, which, de facto, in terms of who rules it, it is. in Germany, and it's symptomatic because although not all of these commissioners are as extreme as he is, I could also mention that at pretty much every official occasion, even if it has nothing to do with the Jewish religion, this man wears a kippah, a Jewish skull cap, because I think he enjoys the feeling of playing the Jew as a way of fighting historical German guilt, to be on the side of the victim rather than the perpetrator. Not all of them are as extreme, but many of them also have Israel connections. In fact, he himself was for a while president of the German Israeli Society, which is the largest Israel lobby group in Germany, and the commissioner for Hamburg. He was president of the Hamburg branch of the German Israeli Society before he became commissioner. Shortly after becoming commissioner, he actually converted to Judaism. He's one of the extremely small number of Jewish anti-Semitism commissioners, and he clearly also converted to Judaism out of a strong Zionist motivation. But now he gets to say, we Jews feel threatened by all these left-wing and Muslim anti-Semites. And anti-Semitism has become a stick to beat, largely to left with, and also migrants, especially Muslim and Arab migrants. Since October, this has been on display especially extremely, and it's no coincidence that in Germany, the far right, both at street level and at a politically organized official level, is stronger than it's been in a long time. Just a couple of weeks ago, there were elections in 2 eastern German states. In one of them, the fascist AfD party got the highest vote share, and they're going to be boycotted by the other parties for a coalition. They didn't get an absolute majority, which of course will bring with it its own problems when you have the most popular party but they don't get into power. And since it's a party that already thrives on kind of dissatisfaction and anger in the populace, this will give them another reason why the system is rigged and everyone is against us, etc. In the second stage, they came in a close second in the vote. This Sunday, there's going to be another election in another eastern state where they have high popularity. And what we see is that even these actual fascists, or in some cases right-wing conservatives, but the line isn't always clear between conservatives and fascists. We see how even they are using anti-Semitism as a weapon against the left and against migrants. How they very often, for example, use the phrase imported anti-Semitism. Because, some of you laugh, probably because Germany has a need to import anti-Semitism, there's enough there already. But the idea is that all these migrants who have come in, from all these extremist, backward, Jew-hating countries, that in allowing them in allowing all this migration, we have imported anti-Semitism. And so, of course, if you imported something, you can export it or deport it. And politicians at the highest level, in fact, Chancellor Scholz himself has said that we have to deport on a grand scale. This kind of rhetoric used to be limited to the right wing, and he's the head of the supposed centre-left party, and he's saying this. So this discourse has been normalised, and if every time there is a demonstration for Palestine, politicians and the media are attacking these demonstrations on the basis of being anti-Semitic, extremists, and logically enough, many of the participants in these demonstrations come from either Palestinian or Arab or other Muslim backgrounds. That is, they fall into the category of people whom the center and the right want to deport. And so it's very easy to use the pretext of fighting anti-Semitism as a way of virtue signaling while actually demanding increasingly inhuman policies. And that's really, I haven't spoken about the events in Palestine themselves because I was trying to give you an idea of how anti-Semitism, the concept, is being abused. And it's maybe worth pointing out as a final point that the same police who are supposedly fighting anti-Semitism by restricting these demonstrations and monitoring them and attacking them are in the process actually also attacking quite a few Jewish demonstrators, such as members of our organization, and also that out of the many cancellations and disinvitations of events, some of them small, others more widely reported on, such as Masha Gessen, the Russian-American reporter who was to receive a prize, but then the prize ceremony was cancelled, that actually 25% of all these event cancellations, disinvitations, cancelled job appointments have actually affected Jewish people. 25%. And the percentage of Jews in Germany is less than 1%. So who is really carrying out anti-Semitic acts and who is really fighting anti-Semitism? Thank you.
All right, we're going to take 5 minutes and then we're going to do the questions. All right, welcome back. So we've had actually scheduled 20 minutes for me to interview the panel, but we're short of time. So I think we're going to do a good combination. So I will ask some questions and I will take some questions from the audience and we'll see how that works. So I'm going to start. So there's been a criticism about the IHRA and the definition of the new anti-Semitism. But one could argue, isn't it necessary with some kind of laws or texts or agreements or something to protect Jews these days where we see that anti-Semitism is growing?
Who should respond?
Who wants to respond?
I mean, I'll offer maybe comments to kick it off. In my presentation, nothing that I said should be taken to mean that I don't believe there's a serious conversation to be had about anti-Semitism and about measures to be taken to measure it, to get a sense of what the real situation with it is, and to take steps to mitigate it. I suppose what I was saying is that the new anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, the agendas and organizations behind it, they really have no useful part to play in that serious conversation. Rather, they've hijacked and derailed it in order to shield Israel from warranted scrutiny. My understanding is that when it comes to discrimination and when it comes to violence, there are laws in place. I don't know the situation in Denmark in terms of how they are, to what extent they are enforced and so forth, but obviously if there are problems with enforcement or gaps in those laws, then for sure they should be corrected. I don't think, however, that the general approach of coming up with these definitions to police, to regulate, and categorize speech, especially speech that contains factual statements, speech that includes some kind of belief about the world, you shouldn't be, in my opinion, trying to divert discussion about speech of that kind into this side debate about what should you be allowed to say. The useful conversation is what's true and what's not. If I make a statement about the world, the important question is it accurate or is it inaccurate? And that's what we should be talking about. But so often, that potentially constructive conversation is preempted at the outset, because instead of asking is it true or not, these epithets are just applied to it, and you end up in this complete shadow boxing, this unproductive meta debate, not about whether it's true, but about, well, what's the motives of the person saying, or something like that.
But couldn't we say that we need signals, or we need symbols to show that we are supporting the Jews who are experiencing anti-Semitism? Isn't that important these days?
But is a definition one of those things? That's the question. Why do we need a definition of that? Again, I brought up this question in my contribution, and I think one really has to think about it, because, as Jørn said, there are laws dealing with crimes, and what we see in the application of this definition is the way people try to extend the realm of what is criminal by saying, if you say X about Israel, maybe you say it's just about Israel, but what you really mean is that it's about Jews. So therefore, what you're saying is hate speech about Jews, which is a crime, so it has to be penalized. And, Germany has a very strong attachment to rules, both to making them and following them. And it's a very common approach to say, okay, if there's a problem, let's make a law against it. And so having this kind of atmosphere around the issue of anti-Semitism, where people are trying to legislate the debate and not to say, well, yeah, really, is something true or is it not? And is someone actually talking about Jews or are they talking about Israel? Is this a political argument or is it an ethnic bias? These standards of objectivity, they're completely thrown out of the window, really. And what's very clear also is in the way, as also Poya was saying, that certain phrases crop up that are not used elsewhere, like the right to exist. Some politicians in Germany have even been demanding that before migrants can become German citizens, they have to recognize Israel's right to exist. And this so-called right is something that's a complete fiction. No state, Denmark doesn't have a right to exist, because there is no such right. We don't need to unpack all that again. It's just an absurd, it's a manipulative device to control the debate in a certain way. So it should be clear that the criteria here are not sincere, good faith arguments about fighting discrimination, and that the entire debate about anti-Semitism is different from debates about other discriminations. This surely should really indicate that there is a problem here, that there is a dishonesty to this debate, and it's not about safety of Jews, it's about the support for Israel.
All right, I have so many more questions, but I'm going to open the questions for the audience too. Let's start over there.
Yeah, I feel really offended. My name is Jørn. I would like to bring up the use of anti-Semitism, because I feel really offended by that term. And no one seems to say, well, it's completely madness to use that word. We have this journal, you can even call him a journalist, Jørn familiar to many of you here. And this guy is actually kind of suggesting that it would be good, that's public, suggesting that it would be good to murder about 1 billion Muslims. So I mean, that is really anti-Semitism. And why is it that he is not in jail? I do not understand.
Yeah, so Joachim Olsen is not here to talk for himself. I think we should try to focus on questions instead of feeling.
But the question is,
yeah.
Why don't we get rid of that term? Why is it still allowed to be used by between us? Or why don't we suggest to the politicians that term be removed from the debate and replaced with something that makes sense?
So the question is, why don't we remove the word anti-Semitism?
Exactly.
Look, I've got. I don't want to police language in that way. Anti-Semitism has come to mean many things, some of which I think are, as I've talked about at length, problematic. If you want to use the word anti-Semitism to refer to discrimination against Jews and advocacy of that, violence against Jews simply because they're Jews, or advocacy of that, I don't really have a problem. If you want to instead call that anti-Jewish hate or anti-Jewish discrimination, I've got no problem with that either. But I don't really, I don't really think it matters what we call it as long as we're clear on what we mean when we use the term. The problem that we've been discussing today is that there have been efforts to use the same word and the same kind of cachet and legitimacy that comes from that absolutely warranted fight against discrimination where it exists and so forth, to extend it to a separate project of discrediting Israel's critics, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
I also feel like this is a real diversion of the genocide which is happening in Gaza, against the Palestinian people. I myself grew up in Germany. I come from the Balkans. In Germany, we have from the 7th grade to the 10th grade, the Nazi time. And it's horrible, But what was the special with the Weiße Rose, Sophie Scholl? What was the special that they risked their life? They knew they were going to be executed, beheaded. What did she say at the end? Why did she do this? She said, my conscience didn't let me. I had to fight for the rights of the Jews. We have to fight for the rights of the Palestinians too. They are Semites, as the Israelis are. So the question is, we have to make sure that it does get to be a diagnosis of what is going on. So we have to, rights for everybody, being anti-Palestinian, the question of being for everybody, not for somebody.
Yeah.
So you cannot rise somebody up or others. We are all human beings.
Yeah, so do you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But who is behind this? Is there also a danger that somebody is promoting this as a way of letting the situation going up, loose, and also getting us into a fight of each other?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understood the question. Can you repeat it?
Who is promoting this debate that is leading to more antisemitism in reality?
So this debate today?
No, the general discussion on antisemitism.
I'm sorry, yeah, okay, it's good that you understand the question. Maybe you can answer also.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you spoken.
Who promotes this discourse?
I mean, generally, these two guys understood why God was asking. You can answer.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie showed how many of the organizations responsible for promoting the definition and also this general discourse and this bias are organizations with ties to Israel, and there are many other examples of the ways in which branches of the Israeli state have interfered, or the way that certain organizations, maybe within the country like Germany or Denmark, are in close contact also with Israeli organizations. And what one always has to remember, though, is that the influence of Israeli state elements and pro-Israel groups shouldn't be thought of as this kind of foreign, outside influence against the will of the host country, but that actually it's because the interests are aligned, and because, most obviously in the case of the USA, that the project of Israel's regional domination is part of the project of Western imperialist domination. And if America didn't think that it was in the interests of American imperialism to be tied to Israel in this way, then it wouldn't support it. But it's an extension of its own power projection, the same way that before Israel was founded, the British Empire saw it as a way to retain power that it had lost in the Middle East. So I think, while identifying the actors here and saying that maybe Organization X is getting money from Israel, just to understand that this is part of an international political project, not just narrow Israeli interests, and the countries have reasons to support Israel.
If I could just add quickly. On the diversion point, is this all a diversion? This is always the dilemma, like with accusations like this, because it's kind of a win-win for the people who make them, because if you ignore them, people think that, if you're a Palestine solidarity group or activist, you get accused of anti-Semitism, you ignore it, people will think, well, it must be true, because they didn't reply. On the other hand, if you take the time to reply and rebut and you're no longer talking about what's happening in Gaza. You're no longer talking about the occupation, the settlements, and so forth. And that is a dilemma. I think probably the right solution is what's happened, which is the vast majority of the movement is focused on organising demonstrations and so forth, but you have some people who are also trying to fight to keep the space for such demonstrations open. I would just say the general political context around the push for incorporating the IHRA definition into law and other sort of kind of censorial efforts, it could well speak to weakness as well as strength on the part of Israel supporters and Israel abroad in public opinion. It's the kind of thing you do when you've given up trying to win on the terrain of public opinion. You switch to trying to insulate elites from public opinion and trying to enact various kinds of deterrents to individuals for engaging in organised action. So in a way it signals weakness. On the other hand, the value of that, power is very centralized in these states, like in the United States, in Britain certainly, when it comes to foreign policy. And so the fact that Israel's lost the battle for public opinion to a great extent, maybe that will matter in the medium term, but by then Gaza might be destroyed. So it's not something to be, it's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture.
Spørgsmål over der? Okay, tak.
Thank you. This question is for Poya. Responding to the growing concerns about freedom of speech, Rosa Lund from Enhedslisten wrote an article in June in Solidaritet.dk saying that criticism of Israel will not be criminalized. Is she wrong, or is she perhaps lying, or what's going on? Do you know?
Do you hear me? Or? Okay. So her service message is I'm no longer with the with the Red Green Alliance. But what I think she's saying is that actually she's just referring to what the Justice Minister told her, because they asked the government, will the product of this action plan be criminalization of speech critical of Israel? And they promised her in that answer that no, it will not. So I just think that's what she's basing it on. However, there's a lot of effective ways to discourage speech, even if you don't criminalize them. I mean, there will always be some ruling orthodoxy, which every right-thinking person will learn, by osmosis or whatever, just following the debate, that it's undone to say something against it. This was true in Victorian England, it's true in 2024 Denmark. A host of issues which are so taboo surrounding it. I mean, a lot of people think the Israel-Palestine conflict is one big taboo, and they don't, want to be mixed up in it. And that's a consequence of these kinds of, accusations. People are the Red-Green Alliance. Fact of the matter is, they're very scared of being labeled anti-Semitic. They truly are, because they know it's going to cost them voters. So that's a way of policing speech without criminalizing it. And I think Rosa is just referring to what the Justice Minister told her. It's on paper, but it's not nearly robust enough. Like as I said in my speech, they may not have adopted the list of 11 examples, but the consultancy groups which take 200,000-300,000 Danish kroners to do monitoring reports, they do use the list of examples. All kinds of people in the debate and newspapers and even politicians, in fact, they do use these examples and consistently conflate criticism of Israel with hatred towards Jews. So it's quite effective without even using law. In fact, it's more effective. If you criminalize it, you'll get a movement that will start talking about free speech. If you don't, it's just in the air.
Thank you. I'm Morten. My grandfather was a lawyer in Berlin before the war, Jewish. And today I'm an activist like you in the demonstrations going on in Denmark. And unlike Britain and particularly Germany, we have some kind of cooperation with police, so we don't have violence. So this is not my real question, but if we have time, it would be nice to hear a little bit about the situation in both Germany and in England, the political climate and the possibility for action. My question is a different one, and you touched the point here in the end. On one hand, this war that is going on in Gaza, now in Lebanon also, as we speak, in the West Bank, with the support of the United States and all of Europe and the rest of the world. What do you call that? And isn't the matter of the new definition of antisemitism, the reason why I mentioned this about my Jewish inheritance was that, of course, I'm against antisemitism, but the new definition is used, as you talked about, to and of course incriminating us, and our Prime Minister want to target us who arrange this demonstration.
I'm sorry, we have 10 to 20 minutes, so the question.
I kind of said the question.
Okay, so you have one question. All right. Can you repeat it, because it was some minutes ago?
I would have been finished and now I'm confused. I'm sorry. No, the thing is, what is going on, and what is it that we're witnessing, and am I tunnel vision when I see it as an attack on us to change, to limit what we can do as individuals?
I really think I noticed two questions in there. One of them was, is this entire discourse about limiting what we can say? And of course it is. That's precisely why that's why we're having this ridiculous discussion today. That's why a very, in my opinion, diligent and wise person as James Stern-Weiner spends so much time bothering to discuss. It is a deflection, from what's going on. So yeah, they keep us busy. But on the other hand, I heard another question that is, Israel is doing this to Gaza and the West Bank and on the precipice of another war in Lebanon, and the entire West is supporting it. So what do we call that? And I'm not sure if I have a certain term for it, but I think it's correct what Wieland said before, that the way we have to look at this is that Israel is doing it for whatever expansionist or ideological reason it has, and the countries supporting Israel are doing it for whatever reasons they have. And in the Danish case, I just think we just, like very much like the UK, we're like, we just follow the lead of the United States. If the United States changed its tune here, we would as well. I'm quite positive of that, which is also, by the way, why I keep telling pro-Palestinian activists that it's very important that we do education in Denmark so that Danish people know what's up, but the prize here is really what the American population thinks, because they truly have the levers of power here. So direct your activism towards the Americans.
Yeah, voters have the choice between two
insanely
pro-Israel candidates.
I mean, the conditions aren't good.
Hello, my name is Jester. I'm a concerned citizen. First of all, thank you, Danny, for your very clear and concise review about the island definition. A couple of years ago, there was a new framework developed, the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think about that? And perhaps what organizations or forces we are empowering if we support this kind of framework? And perhaps this question is also for you, Wieland, because I saw you have written a little bit about that.
So for those who don't know, there's not one definition of anti-Semitism. There's several produced, and they're kind of dueling. And another one is called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, and it was an initiative of many academics who shared many of the criticisms of the IHRA definition, which I laid out, and they tried to present an alternative that would both capture anti-Semitism more effectively and accurately, and would include much more by the way of safeguards against its misuse to silence and discredit legitimate political speech. And there's no doubt, it's on the internet for anyone who wants to read the text in detail. It's a lot better than the IHRA text. Much less easy to use for those kind of illegitimate censorial ends. And of course it was also a political move. It was basically trying to give institutions, this is my assessment from the outside of what I guess was the political strategy behind it. If you're an administrator of a university, you don't know anything about these debates, you suddenly get all, kind of Jewish organizations and sometimes government officials saying, why aren't you doing anything about anti-Semitism? You should adopt this IHRA definition. And you look at the definition, you might think, this doesn't seem right. And you might also get representations from the other side pointing to the threats to free speech and academic freedom it poses. But you don't want to just say, no, we're not going to do anything, because then it makes it look like you don't care about anti-Semitism. So if you have another definition that has a lot of credibility behind it because of the stature of the signatories, you can say, we don't like this definition, but we do care about anti-Semitism. Look, we're adopting this other one. And maybe politically there's some mileage in that. My own view is that this whole approach of trying to come up with definitions for any of these terms, Islamophobia, Hinduphobia, there's a Hinduphobia definition that's been drafted by supporters of Modi in the US, modelled on the IHRA definition, and so on. They all suffer from the same problems. You can't define these terms in any way which isn't either so vague as to be useless in particular cases, or so, kind of concrete and narrow in a way that doesn't capture everything and is almost certainly politically biased in what it decides to capture or not. So I think in the long term, this whole project of having these definitions and trying to police speech using them is fundamentally misconceived.
Yeah, I would very much like to say something to that. I very much agree. I think, as I said in my talk also, that this whole definition agenda is flawed and unproductive. As far as the JDA is concerned, I think maybe one should distinguish between the substance of it and its use, or what one can do with it and what one can't. Because for starters, in contrast to the IHRA definition, which was a product of lobby groups, the JDA is a product of many academics, the majority of them Jewish, and with expertise in Jewish history, Holocaust history, Jewish studies, etc. So, they're people who know what they're talking about, but of course have different opinions as well. And the text of the JDA definition, which also has a long preamble, it's all based really around a kind of discursive principle as well, where you're not saying, okay, this, number one, number two, and number three, these are examples of anti-Semitism. They specifically say, okay, this is something which, is most likely anti-Semitic, but then this is something which is not necessarily. And for example, one popular claim, especially in Germany, is that the movement to boycott Israel is anti-Semitic, and what people like to say in Germany is that this is a new version of the Nazi boycott of Jews. Don't buy from Jews, right? And the JDA addresses this also specifically by saying that boycott is a political tool. It's a non-violent political tool used in many contexts, and so arguments about whether it's legitimate or not to boycott Israel, these are political discussions. This is not about hate towards an ethnic or religious group. And okay, so the text itself is better and can be useful. But again, I think it's important to reject this defining idea, and also it becomes quite clear if one tries, in sort of activism and trying to shape cultural discourse, when one has tried to use the JDA, certainly in Germany, it becomes essentially just a matter of two competing things that are used by two competing sides. So Zionists have the IHRA, and the ones on the supporting Palestine have the JDA, and So in the end, there, the idea that one of them is really right also becomes meaningless, because it's just a matter of who wins the fight.
I have one comment on the usefulness of definitions. I think that, they can, if you're a data analyst or something and you monitor a phenomenon in society, you might be in need of a definition for your coding, right?
That was actually the original purpose.
Exactly. or the original IHRA definition in the UMC actually substituted another definition which was meant for coding and monitoring these events. If you're a data analyst, it could be useful if your point is to raise awareness or something. But as a matter of public policy, definitions are just irrational. They're frozen, they're static, and all of these issues, they're subject to, you cannot produce safeguards that are robust enough to protect against misuse. So these issues, whether or not anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, the fact of the matter is it can be. You can be an anti-Semitic anti-Zionist, right? But it's not inherent. And the thing is, these issues, satirical cartoons, criticisms of Israel, and so on and so forth, they all belong to the realm of free discussion and rational debate. You cannot, by decree, say, this is anti-Semitic because this paper I have in my pocket says so. It's just completely irrational. Right? So I'll give you a recent example. You had 2 Palestinians in the board of Action Aid in Denmark, Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke. All right? The Palestinians are angry with Israel. They go to their private SoMe channels and they share satirical cartoons of Israel. All right? That's the context. And people like in the press and the media are all out with insane moral spasms about how this is, Jew hatred and anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. You can argue that some cartoon comparing Netanyahu with Hitler might be anti-Semitic. You could give an argument for it calmly, rationally. But then we have another person here. He's behind the camera right now. His name is Jonathan Ofir. He writes a calm, collected analysis of these very same cartoons and has a totally different conclusion. He says, in fact, as a Jew, I don't think these are anti-Semitic. These are political in nature, and so on and so forth. It just belongs to rational discussion, and that's where it should be kept. So we shouldn't have these battles over, in fact, bullshit definitions which reduce a very complex world into 2 sentences which are just designed for abuse when they become public policy. These can be useful for data analysts and no one else. This doesn't only pertain to anti-Semitism. You go read books on racism as such, or on Islamophobia as such. Any handbook says you cannot freeze this into a 2-sentence definition. And every time people try, it doesn't work. And there is a time-tested way of fighting prejudice. There really is. We just have to look into it. It's called telling the truth. Education. Yeah.
All right, let's take 2 more questions. So when you're done, can you give the mic to the woman in black behind you? Perfect.
Thank you. My name is Jacob. I am, among other things, also a politician, municipality. And I would like to address actually the title of this whole event about how does this affect our freedom of speech. I recognize this is not a panel of lawyers, but nevertheless, you mentioned, Wieland, something about how this new definition of anti-Semitism affects by some second degree, how it affects even Jews. I think most people have this notion that a gay person can't be anti-LGBT or a black person can't be a member of the Ku Klux Klan or whatever. But let's be honest, by this definition, a lot of Jewish people will potentially face charges for anti-Semitism. And that by itself is grotesque to think, but let's be honest, it episodes in Denmark yet, but as a politician, I'm very verbal, and I'm daily attacked by people who disagree with me. I live with that. But some other people, the notion that they might even go to jail for speaking, their opinion about something can be terrifying. So I'm curious, do you have any examples from either UK or Germany where people have actually been convicted with this new definition of anti-Semitism? And bonus, were any of them Jews?
Well, in Germany, I'd say that since October, there's been a kind of suspension of normal law, basically, as far as Palestine activism is concerned. And although in some areas the IHRA is an instrument of that, for example, by saying that, like when the Berlin Senate said that any artists or cultural workers who want to have public funding for their projects need to sign an endorsement of the IHRA. And actually, it was even an expanded IHRA, which also included recognizing Israel's so-called right to exist. And fortunately, there was enough protests, including from large numbers of Jewish artists in Berlin, that this was withdrawn. But at the moment, there's now another resolution on the table, supposedly about protecting Jewish life, which basically means protecting Israel, which is going to take a similar approach. And one early draft of that even talked about involving the Domestic Intelligence Agency to basically check the record of anybody who is applying for funding. So they'll see, okay, what have you liked on social media? What petitions have you signed? Maybe 5 years ago, you signed some letter saying that boycott should not be criminalized. That's enough. That's good enough. You're an anti-Semite now. And okay, that people were shocked by the idea of involving the intelligence agency, so that was taken back. But this thing is still being finalized, and it's really in Germany we're pretty curious to see what will come out at the end. And a lot of legal scholars and lawyers have really been vocal in their opposition to this. But on the street, like in demonstrations, it's become normalized for the police basically not to need to operate on the basis of actual law in Germany. If they've been told by their superiors, okay, we don't want to see the word genocide at any of these demonstrations, and someone is holding a sign saying stop the genocide, and the police come and say, no, you can't do that. Put away the sign, or we'll arrest you. And then you say, sorry, is this illegal? What's the law forbidding this? And they'll say, look, just put it away or we'll arrest you. Right? They don't even feel they have to be accountable, and they don't even know themselves. They just do what their superiors tell them, and it doesn't matter what the law says. And anything can be. There are a couple of paragraphs in the German Penal Code, especially relating to hate speech or incitement, and they'll just cite these, pretty much at will. They'll say, oh yes, this is incitement to violence, because you said Israel is an apartheid state. So, this could argue that Israel is invalid, Israel must be destroyed, Jews must be killed, whatever. There's always some harebrained argumentation there. So the law, actually, the very concept of legality, of the police operating on fixed laws with a consensual interpretation of these laws, has been completely undermined and overturned in Germany on the issue of Palestine. So to me, there's really a profound crisis of democracy going on.
All right, so time is up, but you wanted to ask a question from the start, so last question.
Okay, thank you. My question is about the German left. Because I spent 4 days in Erfurt, Germany during the election, and I think I'm somewhat shocked to my core. would you explain in this discourse in Germany what is sort of the position of Die Linke and but also of BSV, the Bündnis Wagenknecht, and then maybe the anti-Deutsch sort of sentiment or in the people on the street in anti-fascist group? Thank you.
Okay, well that's quite a long, quite a big topic to get into. I'll try and just break it down to a few basic statements. So Die Linke, the left party, which is at this point the largest, self-declared left-wing party that has parliamentary representation. They've increasingly moved away from an initial, more or less anti-imperialist stance towards becoming more mainstream, because of course any party that wants to get power has to make compromises, and they thought they could do that. So in the leadership there are elements that are, let's say, Israel-friendly, and among the members there are some who are vehemently pro-Israel because they think that this is what German history requires of them. And then there are others who still do cling to the left principles like anti-imperialism, and so the party is very divided and pretty useless. And this newer party, Bündnis Wagenknecht, which was formed when this Bündnis Wagenknecht went out, exited Die Linke, formed a new party. At first people thought this was kind of a novelty because she's using some left economic arguments to do more like support for workers, etc. And at the same time drawing on right-wing culture war against immigration, against also minorities and so-called woke discourse, too much identity politics, etc. I think there's been too much mystification about some sort of left-right combination. This is just basically social democrat territory. This is just the mainstream parties. If you go to the Social Democrat Party in Germany, maybe 20 years ago, they were also a bit more economically left in some areas, and they also have people who are culturally right. I mean, nowadays, the Social Democrats are very open about it being culturally right. So to me, it's not a novelty, and also they rely so much now on racist rhetoric that they're unacceptable to anyone who's on the left. Unfortunately, they're the only party that's really consistently anti-militarist, anti-war, and that calls out Israel for militarism, and also calls out NATO militarism, which the rest of the parties support. Yeah, that's the sorry state of German politics.
All right, time's up. Thank you so much for today, for your speeches and your talks and your answers. One of the organizers want to say some words? Yeah.
Just a few. Yes, so on behalf of the organizers who are Dansk Islamisk Center og det palæstinensiske kulturinstitut og studenterorganisationen NASIM og Jøder for retfærdig fred. A heartfelt thank you for coming and enlightening us today. It was illuminating. Also, yes, and so...
and the thanks.
Yes, and so please receive these gifts as a token of our gratitude.
Thank you.
Oh, me too. Thank you.
So, thank you to the audience for your participation and your enthusiasm. Also, thank you to who are den almennyttige fond af 15. september 1968, 1. maj-fonden og Græsrodsbevægelsen. Ja. Ja, thank you.